Hey guys, tonight we wander into the cobblestone labyrinth of Victorian London, where fog clings to your boots like a jealous lover and black-veiled widows drift like shadows through the gaslit haze. You catch the rustle of crepe fabric brushing. Against wrought iron gates, the faint smell of damp coal smoke mixing with perfume dabbed on a lace handkerchief, and you can't help but wonder what hides behind those lowered eyes and stiff postures. The truth, whispered in alleys and hinted at in scandal sheets, is that grief was rarely the only weight on those narrow shoulders. Loneliness burned hotter than a coal fire, and desire does not vanish simply because society demands. Silence. You probably won't survive this little journey without questioning every dusty museum portrait you've ever passed, every demure widow in every oil painting staring back at you with that unreadable smile. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is where you're listening, because history feels different at midnight in Toronto than it does at dawn in Manila. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself trailing behind a widow in 1873, her black skirts swaying just inches from your hand as she slips down a narrow lane off Oxford Street. Everyone else sees a grieving woman, dressed head to toe in mourning attire that makes her look like a moving shadow. But you notice the way her eyes dart, the quickening of her breath, the careful glance over her shoulder. She isn't walking to church. She's heading toward a doorway, half hidden by a crooked sign that claims to be a tea supplier. The real tea, of course, is poured in whispers upstairs. As you climb the creaking steps behind her, you hear laughter muffled by thick curtains, a sound so out of place with mourning that it makes your skin prickle. You're stepping into a space historians still argue about. Were these secret societies for pleasure real, or merely the fevered imagination of moralists? Either way, the scent of candle wax and spilled sherry assures you something is happening. And it isn't knitting circles. A hostess in velvet, her neckline dangerously low for the decade, welcomes the widow with a kiss on the cheek and a knowing smile. You feel the sudden shift of atmosphere, as though the heavy layers of grief have been shrugged off at the door, leaving behind only skin, curiosity, and the soft hum of conversation. In one corner, a book lies open on a table, Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra, its illustrations scandalous enough that Queen Victoria herself pretended such things did not exist. A widow traces the lines with a gloved finger, her cheeks flushed not from sorrow, but from anticipation. The widow you followed removes her veil slowly, as though performing an unveiling ritual, and laughter greets her. You realize that this is not simply about sex. It is about reclaiming breath, life, and agency in a world that told women to vanish into black fabric the moment their husband's hearts stopped beating. And because this is Victorian London, the irony is delicious. The same society that published moral essays railing against female lust also tolerated a quiet economy of private clubs, health cures, and literary salons where widows could taste freedom. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen joke we stumbled upon in earlier histories? Here, in this world, the equivalent oddity might be a so-called physician offering herbal potions guaranteed to restore vital forces, peddled right alongside silk corsets designed to be unlaced in a hurry. One widow leans over to tell a tale she swears comes from Eleanor Herman's Chronicles of Royal Mistresses, about a queen who kept her lovers hidden behind chapel walls. The others giggle, not shocked but delighted, because hearing that powerful women bent the rules gives permission to bend a few themselves. You sip the watered sherry someone presses into your hand and wonder if the walls themselves aren't listening. Outside, carriages rattle by, unaware of the warmth pulsing within. Inside, widows laugh, sigh, and live again. By the time the hour grows late, you realize the hook is set. This isn't just a story about hidden clubs. It's a story about survival, rebellion, and the way desire slips through every seam society tries to stitch shut. And you, here in the shadows, are invited to keep walking deeper into it. You follow the widow further inside, through a set of double doors that close with the hush of heavy velvet, and suddenly you are in a parlor that feels more like a dream than a room. Gaslight flickers against crimson wallpaper. Gilded mirrors catch fragments of faces and lace, and the air hums with a strange mixture of laughter, perfume, and the clink of crystal glasses. Here, morning is suspended like a forgotten coat, and behind closed doors, the widows of London step into another skin entirely. The woman you have been trailing pauses to remove her gloves, fingers trembling only slightly before she drops them onto a silver tray as though discarding her grief. A hostess guides her to a corner seat, where other women in black crepe and jet jewelry lean forward, their voices conspiratorial, their eyes gleaming with something more than sorrow. You realize you are witnessing the unraveling of a double. Life out on the streets, these women are bound in stiff etiquette manuals and whispered pity, but here they are allowed to laugh too loudly, to sigh too deeply, and to touch the world again. Historians still argue whether such clubs truly flourished, or whether the stories were embroidered by scandal-hungry writers. But the evidence lingers in police blotters, court whispers, and satirical magazines that never quite manage to name names. A story is told near you half in jest of a widow who, too weary of her solitude, staged her own seance, only to find the spirit she summoned looked suspiciously like the butcher's apprentice. Everyone laughs, and it reminds you of Michel Foucault's insistence that sexuality is never simply repressed, but constantly negotiated through rituals, languages, and carefully coded performances. These performances are happening right before your eyes. A playful hand resting too long on another's sleeve, a wink passed across the parlor, a whispered question that sounds suspiciously like an invitation. In the far corner, a table is covered with books, most scandalous of all a dog-eared copy of Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra, smuggled from an India few in this room will ever see. One widow, emboldened by sherry, reads aloud a passage about the art of kissing, her cheeks flushed, her friends giggling like schoolgirls, discovering a forbidden primer. The irony, of course, is that these women have been married, some for decades, and yet society expects them to return to a state of desexualized innocence the moment their husbands' funerals end. The club itself is a rebellion against that expectation, a quiet insistence that mourning does not erase desire. As you watch, another widow recounts a tale straight from Eleanor Herman's Chronicles of French Courtiers, about a king who comforted his grieving mistress by arranging nightly masquerades where she could choose her partner behind a mask. Women swoon at the audacity of it, and one remarks slyly that perhaps their own gatherings are no different masks of lace and ritual rather than porcelain, but masks nonetheless. A joke ripples through the parlor about the so-called medical treatments offered to widows suffering from hysteria, a condition doctors of the time believed could be relieved with vigorous pelvic massage administered in the name of science. The absurdity makes you chuckle, and yet you notice how the laughter in the room carries a sharper edge, as though mocking the very system that once treated them like fragile dolls while simultaneously exploiting their bodies. The widow you followed earlier now joins the circle, leaning forward as another woman describes an erotic spirit legend Webb once noted, a ghost said to haunt a Roman bath, whispering secrets of pleasure to those brave enough to bathe alone. At night, whether the story is true hardly matters. What matters is the shiver that passes through the women, the way imagination itself becomes a form of rebellion, a spark of warmth against the chill of endless morning. And in that moment, you realize that this hidden club is less about breaking rules than about rewriting them, less about scandal than about survival. Behind closed doors, Widows are not merely figures in black. They are storytellers, explorers, and conspirators of desire. The gaslights flicker lower, laughter softens into murmurs, and you lean back, lulled by the rhythm of voices and the fight. Subtle clink of glasses, carried deeper into the secret current that flows beneath the stiff facade Victorian. Respectability. You linger in that crimson parlor, long enough to notice that what began as whispers and giggles now unfolds into something far more inventive, for the widows are not content with simply sharing sherry and stories. They design their own comforts, their own amusements, and even their own rules, as though grief has granted them both permission and cover to craft a life denied by daylight. One corner of the room has been rearranged into a kind of stage where heavy drapes and gilt-framed mirrors reflect flickering shadows. And here, the women gather for parlor games with a decidedly forbidden edge. A circle forms around a widow who holds up a slip of paper with a drawing copied from the Kama Sutra, her voice trembling with laughter as she challenges the others to guess the meaning. And when they collapse in giggles, it feels less like scandal and more like therapy, a reclaiming of agency through humor and shared daring. You drift nearer and catch a whisper of Eleanor Herman's stories about mistresses who invented elaborate games for their royal patrons, some involving dice, others involving poetry, and you notice how history itself becomes the raw material for invention here. What kings and queens once played in gilded chambers, widows now play in rented parlors lit by gaslight. Someone produces a deck of cards, not for gambling, but for a peculiar Victorian diversion, in which each card corresponds to a challenge. Some tame recite a verse from Tennyson, balance a glass on your head, and others daring, like mimicking a kiss described in the Kama Sutra, or inventing a new form of dance. The women laugh so loudly, you wonder how the neighbors fail to hear, and yet you suspect that even if they do, they know better than to knock. Historians still argue whether these clubs were truly widespread or confined to a handful of daring cities, whether they represented rebellion or simply a passing amusement. But as you watch, the truth feels undeniable. This is a community inventing its own language of comfort, one that speaks louder than morning bells ever could. Across the room, a widow demonstrates a curious contraption she swears was prescribed by a physician to restore her nervous vitality. Essentially a spring-loaded chair that rattles when she sits upon it, and the absurdity nearly topples the circle into tears of laughter. Someone compares it to crocodile dung, once used by Egyptians as a contraceptive, and suddenly the parlor fills with a debate about oddities and remedies across time, from silphium plants that may have gone extinct due to overuse, to strange medieval brews meant to rekindle desire. The sheer variety of inventions convinces you that humanity has always been clever when it comes to pleasure, no matter what century wears the crown. A widow leans against the mantelpiece, her eyes glowing in the gaslight as she recalls a tale from Michel Foucault's writings about how power and sexuality are endlessly entangled, how repression only ever produces new forms of expression. And you see that very theory embodied in this room every time the world outside tries to bind them in crepe. The women invent another parlor game, another story, another contraption to keep living. At one point, the hostess announces a masquerade, producing masks of lace and satin, and the room transforms into a theater of anonymity where partners can be chosen without fear of scandal. The widow you have been following slips on a mask of deep violet, her body language shifting instantly, shoulders loosening, hands no longer trembling. She approaches another woman, offers a playful curtsy, and together they step into the circle for a mock dance, twirling until skirts flare and laughter swallows grief whole. You can almost hear the ghosts of their late husbands scolding from beyond, but the sound is drowned out by applause and cheering. What strikes you most is how ordinary this invention of comfort feels once you are inside it. How natural it is for human beings to find ways to soften pain with laughter, companionship, and even desire. When you step back to take in the whole, room is seen as both surreal and oddly practical. Widows in black garments inventing joy with books, cards, contraptions, and masks, each item a tool of healing disguised as scandal. You realize that this is how survival has always worked, not just in Victorian London, but in every age. People invent comforts where none are offered. People turn sorrow into games, and sometimes the most forbidden laughter is the laughter that saves them. You hardly have time to recover from the masquerade's dizzying whirl before the heavy curtains ripple again. And suddenly, you are reminded that outside these walls, the world is not so forgiving. For the club exists only because society chooses not to see it, and you realize how precarious the arrangement is. Imagine the widow stepping back into daylight the next morning, her black veil restored, her laughter hidden beneath layers of etiquette manuals and tea-time platitudes. Out there, the rules of mourning are ruthless. 2 full years draped in neck. Crepe, no jewelry beyond dull jet, no dances, no smiles too bright, no remarriage too soon, lest the neighbors whisper. Yet here she is, inside this candlelit parlor, letting her veil slip to the floor like a discarded skin. And the contrast sends a thrill through you. How can 2 worlds coexist so closely? How can a woman's body be simultaneously erased and die? Desire? That tension is the hook, pulling you deeper, because once you glimpse the double life, you can never unsee it. Historians still argue whether polite society knew of these clubs and chose to ignore them, or whether the entire phenomenon was an elaborate rumor, but the silence in official records feels suspicious, as if erasure itself was the proof. You imagine the hypocrisy of Victorian gentlemen writing sermons on chastity while attending their own clandestine gatherings, while widows slipped unnoticed into their own havens of pleasure. The air of danger sharpens everything in the room. Each whisper, each glance, each touch across a velvet armrest carries the thrill of being forbidden. A widow seated near you recounts a tale from Eleanor Herman's Chronicles of a queen who kept her mourning attire spotless in public, but secretly filled her bedchamber with musicians, dancers, and lovers to keep grief from crushing her. Story is met with sighs and murmurs, because it echoes their own predicament. They too must wear sorrow, like a costume, while searching for warmth behind closed doors. Another woman, with a sly smile, tells of how certain physicians justified therapeutic intimacy for widows on the grounds of medical necessity. A reminder of Michel Foucault's point that power often disguises itself as science. The absurdity makes the group laugh, but beneath the laughter you hear something darker, a recognition that society could bend rules for men, but would rather police women into silence. One hostess produces a satirical newspaper clipping mocking hysterical widows who dared to laugh at theater performances before their mourning period was over, and the sheer cruelty of it sets the room buzzing. They joke, of course, but the joke is sharpened by defiance, a way of spitting back at the society that would prefer them invisible. A widow leans closer to you, her perfume rich with roses, and whispers about the risks discovery could mean: scandal, ostracism, or even legal trouble. Yet the thrill of secrecy makes her cheeks glow brighter, and you realize the forbiddance is part of the comfort. The walls seem to lean inward, keeping secrets with the women who fill them. Odd details drift in too. One widow brings up silphium again, the ancient plant supposedly used to control fertility, and compares it to the strange Victorian fad of arsenic wafers for pale skin, noting with a laugh that women have always risked much for beauty and desire. The conversation flows from scholarly to absurd, from tragic to comic, as easily as the sherry flows from glass to glass. And still the central paradox remains. The very society that insists on covering widows in black cloth turns a blind eye when they sneak through side doors into crimson parlors. That paradox is the fire that keeps you awake, that keeps you wanting to know how far they will push, how much they will risk, how long they can sustain the masquerade. The hook tonight is not just scandal, it is survival disguised as scandal, and you, caught in the tension, cannot look away. The night stretches longer, and as the candles burn lower, you notice that the laughter has softened into a kind of reverent hush, for the widows now begin to exchange tales, not merely of themselves, but of history's lovers. Stories passed from book to voice like contraband treasures. You lean closer, ears pricked, as one widow recites an anecdote from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, where a royal mistress in France so captivated her grieving monarch that he built her a hidden chamber above his chapel, so he might climb to her bed straight from his prayers. The women sigh at the audacity of such blending of sanctity and desire, and you can feel how the story both shocks and comforts them, for it suggests that even those enthroned by God are not immune to the ache of loss and the salve of intimacy. Another widow counters with a tale from Peter Webb's Erotic Spirit, a curious legend of an Italian widow who is said to conjure her late husband's ghost through whispered incantations, only to admit years later that the ghost was her gardener disguised beneath a sheet. The room erupts in knowing laughter, the kind that peels away layers of solemnity and leaves only the raw joy of recognition. And here lies the strange magic. These stories are not simply gossip or entertainment, they are survival tools, binding the women to a lineage of defiance that stretches from palaces to parlor rooms. You notice the sparkle in their eyes when one of them opens a slim volume of Foucault, his insistence that sexuality is always shaped by power, echoing in their murmurs as they debate whether these secret clubs represent rebellion or capitulation, liberation or yet another performance forced upon them. Historians still argue whether such clubs were liberation, disguised as scandal, or scandal disguised as therapy, but the widows here seem uninterested in theory. They care only that the stories give them breath. A woman draped in heavier crepe, and the rest, perhaps newer to grief, speaks haltingly of how her neighbors watch her every trip to the market, counting the days since the funeral, and how she feels her very body has become public property. Her voice shakes, but another widow reaches across the table and takes her hand, assuring her that here she is unseen by judgment and seen by sisters. The gesture, simple as it is, carries more comfort than any sermon. You are reminded of how society once treated widows as dangerous too independent, too uncontrolled, and how oddities arose to contain them, from strict mourning dress codes to bizarre prescriptions like sleeping on cold stones to temper the blood. The absurdity makes you chuckle, though softly, for the widow's confession lingers in the room like incense. Then, with a sudden mischievous grin, another woman changes the mood by recounting a bawdy Greek anecdote from Vatsiana's Kama Sutra about a widow who supposedly outwitted her nosy neighbors by disguising her nightly visitor as a physician making urgent house calls. The women laugh so hard tears glisten on their cheeks, and you feel the tension of grief dissolving again into warmth. Around you, the tailies weave into one another royal mistresses, ghostly gardeners, scheming queens, clever physicians, until history itself feels less like a dusty chronicle and more like a chorus of voices reminding these widows that they are not alone. That desire has always persisted in the cracks of propriety. One woman muses aloud that perhaps their own stories will one day be told the same way, footnotes in some future book that scholars will argue about endlessly, and everyone nods with a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. You realize that what you are witnessing is not just a gathering, but a living archive, each widow adding her own stanza to a long poem of survival. The fire pops, the sherry dwindles, and still they lean closer to one another, feeding on the warmth of shared tales. By now you have lost count of how many stories have spilled across the table, but you know that each one has become another thread tying these women together, threads invisible to the outside world, but unbreakable within these walls. And as you sit back, lulled by their voices, you feel the hook pulling you further. For you want to know not just the stories they tell, but the lives they will dare to create once the stories are done. The parlor has grown warmer now. Candles burning low and sherry glasses nearly empty, but the widows seem newly animated, for their talk has turned toward the oddities and diversions that lace every age of desire. And you realize that laughter, even more than touch, is the true medicine. Here, a woman with a mischievous grin recalls reading in Peter Webb's erotic spirit of an ancient custom where lovers used honey mixed with herbs as both a charm and a lubricant, and she wonders aloud whether such concoctions might be improved. With Victorian marmalade, the room erupts in laughter, and you can almost see the orange rinds glistening absurdly under gaslight. Another widow interrupts with her own discovery. An apothecary once tried to sell her a tonic of phosphorus and brandy as a cure for melancholy, assuring her it would make her both radiant and fertile. She sips her watered sherry now and shakes her head, calling it snake oil, though she admits she felt brighter after a few doses, which may have been nothing more than the brandy. You sense the way these absurd remedies become a kind of communal sport, each tale of oddity, another stitch in the quilt of their shared comfort. Someone brings up the notorious use of crocodile dung in ancient Egypt as a contraceptive, and the room dissolves again into hilarity. The very word crocodile, taking on a scandalous life of its own, whispered with mock solemnity until everyone is wiping tears from their eyes. And yet, beneath the laughter, there is serious work being done, because each oddity opens space to talk about their own bodies, their own needs, in a world that demands they remain silent. A widow leans forward to remind the group of Michel, Foucault's argument that power thrives in silence, and she insists that their laughter is itself a form of rebellion, a refusal to let mourning become muteness. Historians still argue whether women of the period truly found such freedom in hidden clubs, or whether later writers simply projected fantasies backward. But as you sit here in this imagined parlor, you feel how plausible it is, because the hunger for joy does not respect Eris. To prove her point, another widow pulls a small object from her reticule, a tiny vial of lavender oil, said by her late husband to have aphrodisiac qualities. She passes it around, each woman dabbing her wrist, inhaling the soothing scent, and suddenly the parlor feels more like a ritual space than a drawing room, each participant bound together by invisible threads of memory and longing. Someone mentioned silphium again, the legendary plant of the ancient world that was harvested to extinction, and they sigh over the thought of a remedy so effective that it vanished under human desire, a reminder of how appetite and loss are forever entwined. The widow you have been following all evening lifts her veil from the chair where she cast it earlier, twirling it between her fingers as she recounts an anecdote from Eleanor, Herman's chronicles about a royal court where widows were invited to secret dinners hosted by mistresses themselves, as though solidarity between women could trump the jealousies of kings. The idea delights the group, and one suggests half seriously that they should host their own dinners for newly widowed arrivals, complete with guides to oddities both ancient and modern. The suggestion turns into a game. Each woman invents her own absurd remedy or ritual, some real, some fabricated, and they challenge the others to guess which is which. You hear concoctions of oyster shells ground into wine, moonlight collected in jars, laughter captured in ribbons, and though you know most are invented, the game blurs the line between truth and imagination, and in that blur lies comfort. You sit back as the conversation drifts into speculation about what future scholars will say of them, and you realize that the oddities are more than jokes. They are markers of resilience, evidence that even the strangest remedies can carry hope. When official remedies fail, the parlor is quieter now, laughter softening into chuckles, but the warmth lingers, a glow that has nothing to do with gaslight. These widows, draped in black and dismissed by the world outside, have conjured from oddities and diversions a world that feels more alive than any church sermon, more sustaining than any etiquette book. And you, caught in their circle, feel the weight of history shift around you, as though the laughter itself has become a secret archive. The hush after laughter is almost heavier than silence, and you feel it now as the women shift in their seats, eyes gleaming in the candlelight, voices low but intense, for they have turned from oddities to argument, and the air brims with the sharp thrill of debate. You lean in as one widow, her mourning veil still clutched like a flag of war, insists that these secret gatherings are acts of liberation, a quiet revolution against a society that would rather bury them alive with their husbands. Her words crackle with fire, and you feel the hook tugging you closer, because she speaks what no one else dares. That pleasure can be survival. Yet across the table another widow shakes her head, her jet jewelry rattling, and counters that what they do is betrayal, that indulging desire is to spit on the memory of their dead. The room tightens, the atmosphere suddenly sharp as a drawn blade, and you realize you are watching more than banter. You are witnessing the fracture lines of an entire age. Historians still argue whether such clubs represented genuine freedom, or only another form of constraint, a performance staged in the shadows while true power remained untouched. And here that debate unfolds in real time, each widow embodying her own thesis. One cites Michel Foucault, whispering that repression only creates new languages of rebellion, and that their very gathering is proof. Another invokes scripture, saying society has rules for a reason, and though her voice trembles, you can hear the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders. Into the tension slips a story, as stories always do, offered like a balm. One widow recalls an anecdote from Eleanor Herman's Chronicles, where a grieving queen who obeyed every morning rule by day secretly kept a lover by night, a lover who wore her late husband's clothes to keep up appearances even as he warmed her bed. The paradox makes the room exhale, half in laughter, half in awe, for it proves how even royalty walked the razor's edge between loyalty and longing. Another widow adds a tale from Peter Webb, describing how medieval convents were rumored to hide not only prayer but passion, women debating whether vows of chastity were prisons or sanctuaries. And suddenly, the parlor feels connected to every cloister and court across time where women have asked the same question: is desire defiance or devotion? The widow you have been following listens intently, her mask long discarded, her eyes darting between speakers, and when she finally speaks, her voice is steady, carrying the weight of choice. She tells of how her late husband's friends still watch her, still judge her purchases, still measure the slope of her smile, as though she is an artifact they own. And she asks, almost in a whisper, whether seeking joy here is truly betrayal, or whether it is the only honest way to live. The question hangs in the room like incense smoke, curling into every corner, and you know there is no answer. Yet the debate does not divide them, not truly. It binds them tighter, for even in disagreement they are alive, and being alive is itself the point. A widow lifts her glass in mock toast, saying that perhaps the real betrayal is to let grief erase you, and the others laugh, soft but defiant. Someone murmurs about silphium again, that lost plant, wondering aloud whether its extinction is a warning about desire unchecked, or simply proof that humans have always wanted more than the world could give. You watch their faces flicker in the candlelight, shadows dancing like arguments made flesh, and you feel the thrill of the unknown. No one here can predict whether history will call them rebels or sinners, survivors or traitors. And that, perhaps, is why you cannot look away. The hook tonight is sharper than scandal. It is the unbearable question of how far one can bend under grief before breaking, and whether breaking the rules is the only way to remain whole. The debate fades not with resolution, but with exhaustion, the kind of quiet that comes when the heart has been wrung out and only a soft hum remains. You feel the room loosen again, shawls slipping from shoulders, eyes softening, lips curved. Not in laughter now, but in something gentler, more fragile. The hostess rises to douse the lamps one by one, and each flame that dies seems to settle the widows deeper into themselves, as though the night is folding them back into morning, yet leaving behind a secret warmth. You follow the widow you have, shadowed all evening as she gathers her veil, smoothing the fabric as if rehearsing the mask she must wear for the world outside. The parlor, once a stage of scandal and laughter, now feels like a sanctuary slowly dissolving into memory. You catch one last whisper Eleanor Herman's tale of a mistress who slipped from her king's bed straight into confession, crossing herself with the same hands that had moments before caressed him, and the women sigh, for the story mirrors their own duality, holiness and desire braided together in the same breath. Someone murmurs about how historians will never know whether nights like this were rebellion or survival, and the uncertainty itself feels like a lullaby, for it means the secret remains theirs. The widow pauses by the door, inhaling deeply as if storing the perfume of sherry, wax, and laughter in her lungs, something to carry into the long silence of daylight. Outside, gas lamps flicker against mist, casting long shadows that stretch like fingers across the cobblestones, and she steps into them with her veil lowered, her posture once again stiff, yet you know that under the crepe, her cheeks still glow with the memory of masks and games and stories. You trail behind, the night air cool against your skin, and the city sounds different now, softer somehow, as though the laughter within the parlor still echoes faintly through the fog. You realize that these clubs, whether real or imagined, whether scattered or secret, serve a purpose that no law or sermon could provide. They give permission to breathe again. A sudden thought pricks at you. How many widows passed through these doors? How many stories vanished unrecorded? How many secrets still rest in locked trunks or burned letters? And you know that even if the details fade, the truth of longing remains eternal. The widow turns a corner, her steps slowing, as if reluctant to re-enter the house where every object reminds her of absence. You watch her fingers linger on the doorknob, pausing in the threshold between two worlds, until she finally exhales and disappears inside, her shadow merging with the dark hallway beyond. The street grows quiet. The last carriage rattles away, and you are left alone with the gas lamps and the echo of Forbidden's laughter. The story has no dramatic finale, no scandal splashed across newspapers, only this: a handful of women who carried their secrets in silence, who found comfort in each other's company, and who proved, in their quiet way, that survival is often hidden in the smallest rebellions. And as you stand there, lulled by the dim glow of lamps and the distant tolling of a church bell, you feel your own eyelids grow heavy, as though history itself were tucking you in with a whispered reminder that even in the strictest of ages, there was always room for laughter, always space for desire, always the possibility of secret survival. So let the gaslight blur into candlelight, let the veil drift back over the door, let the footsteps fade into silence. The widows have gone home, the secrets are safe, and you can finally rest, carrying with you the warmth of a story that belongs as much to dreams as to history. End of script. Sweet dreams.